There is a small white card in the inside pocket of my coat, and the card has a phone number written on it in blue ink. And the handwriting is the careful, slanted handwriting of a woman who once spent 11 hours sitting beside my hospital bed without sleeping. And I have been carrying the card for 3 weeks now without calling the number. Because the calling is the only thing left in my second life that I'm still afraid of. And the being afraid of it is the small, clean reason I'm finally telling this story. My name is Kaylin Ross. I am 32 years old in this life. In the other life, the one I'm about to tell you about, I died at 34 in the back of a black car on a wet road outside the city with 2 bullets in my chest and the woman I had been planning to marry sitting in the front passenger seat of the same car. He's talking on her phone in the calm, bored voice of a woman placing a dinner reservation, telling someone on the other end of the line that the package had been delivered and that the back end could be cleaned up in the morning. I want you to remember the phrase "the package" because the phrase is the small piece of language my brain held onto in the half second before I stopped breathing, and the holding onto is the reason I came back. And the coming back is the reason I'm sitting in a coffee shop on the corner of Mercer and Vine on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 years and 4 months before the wet road. With the white card in my pocket and a coffee getting cold in front of me and a decision I have been delaying for 3 weeks because the delaying is the only thing that has felt like mine in the entire second life so far. The card is from a woman named Dr. Mera Halverson. She is 34 years old. She is a cardiac surgeon at St. Aurel Memorial, the same hospital where, in the other life, she would have been the resident on call the night a black car dropped a man with 2 bullets in his chest at the emergency entrance. And the resident would have spent 11 hours fighting to keep the man alive, and the fighting would have failed at 6:14 in the morning, and the resident would not have known, until much later, that the man on her table had been the boyfriend of a young woman from the Vorel family. A woman the resident had once shared a college dormitory with for a single semester 11 years earlier. A woman the resident had quietly disliked then and would more quietly dislike now. She would not have known any of this in the other life. And I said because in the other life, I never met Mera Halverson while I was alive. I met her after I died in the strange floating space that I am not going to try to describe, where I watched her wash her hands at a small basin in a hospital corridor and then cry, very quietly, against the tile wall for a man whose name she had never been told. The crying was the only thing in the other life that made me want to come back. In this life, the second life, I met her 3 weeks ago. I met her in a way that would not have been possible in the other life because in the other life, I had never been inside St. Aurel Memorial except as a corpse. And in the second life, I walked into St. Aurel Memorial on the morning of the second week of my second chance, on purpose, in one with a small ache in my chest that I had been engineering for 2 days by drinking too much coffee and sleeping too little. I wanted to be examined. I wanted to be examined by her specifically. I had looked her up in the hospital directory under the small, careful pretext of researching cardiac specialists in the city. And I had requested an appointment with her using the small, careful lie that my regular doctor had referred me, and the lie had worked, and I had walked into her examination room at 9:30 in the morning, and I had seen her face for the first time with my eyes open. And the seeing had almost made me forget the small, careful script I had been preparing for 2 weeks. She had been kind. She had been the kind that doctors are when they are good at being doctors. Bitty, the kind that does not waste motion and does not perform reassurance and does not pretend to be your friend. The kind that simply pays attention to you with the quiet, competent attention of a person who has been trained to find the small wrong thing inside the larger collection of right things. And the attention was the same attention I had felt across the strange floating space when she had been crying against the tile wall in the corridor. She had taken my pulse. She had listened to my chest. She had asked me in a calm professional voice how long the ache had been present, and I had told her 2 days, and she had asked me about my sleep and my caffeine intake and my recent stress, and I had told her, truthfully, that I had been sleeping badly and drinking too much coffee, and she had nodded and she had said, "Mr. Ross, yeah, I'm going to tell you what I think. And I think there is nothing wrong with your heart, and I think you have been doing the small specific things that produce the sensation you are describing, and I am going to recommend that you stop doing them." She said, "Mr. Ross, I am also going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask it because in 11 years of practicing medicine, I have learned to ask it when the answer to the medical question is too clean. And the question is, why did you really come to see me today? I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because the feeling is the part of the second life I'm still trying to figure out how to carry. I felt seen. The scene was not the scene of being recognized. The scene was the scene of being noticed by a person who had been trained to notice and who had pointed her noticing at me, yes, and who was now waiting for me to give her an answer that did not insult either of us. I sat on the small examination table in the small examination room and I tried to figure out what to tell her. And the truth was, the only thing I had that fit the size of her question, and the truth was the one thing I could not say, because the truth was that I had died in the other version of my life, and that she had been the woman who had cried for me in the corridor, and that I had come to find her in this life, because the crying had been the only honest thing anyone had ever done for me, and saying any of that would have ended the appointment in a way that would have ended the second life along with it. I said, Dr. Halverson, I came to see you because someone I trust said you were the best. And because I have been making some changes in my life recently, and I wanted to start by making sure my body was strong enough to handle them. I said it in the calm, careful voice I had practiced in the mirror that morning. The voice was a smaller version of the truth, and the smaller version was the only version I could give her. And I'm not proud of the smallness, but I'm also not ashamed of it. Because the smallness was the thing the second life required from me at that moment. And the second life had been given to me on conditions I had not negotiated. She nodded. She said, Mr. Ross, that is a reasonable thing to do, and I am happy to help you do it. And I am going to write you a small set of recommendations about your sleep and your coffee, and I am going to ask you to come back in 3 months for a follow-up. And she wrote the recommendations on a small pad. She handed me the small white card that I have been carrying in my coat pocket for the last 3 weeks. She said, this is my direct line. If anything changes, please call. Most patients do not call. Some do. The ones who do are the ones who get the best outcomes. Then she shook my hand, and the shaking of her hand was the second time in my second life that I had touched her, the first being the moment she had taken my pulse. And the touching was the thing I am going to remember when I am very old. Because the touching was the small physical proof that the second life was real, and that the woman I had come to find existed in this version of the world, and that the bullets in the wet road did not have to happen. I left the hospital. I walked the 11 blocks back to my apartment. And I sat on the small couch in the small living room, and I held the white card in my hands, and I tried to plan the next step, and the planning was the part of the second life that I had been avoiding for the entire 2 years and 4 months since I had woken up in my own bed at the age of 29 on a morning that had already happened to me once. And the avoiding had been the small private fact of the second life that the title of this recording is going to want me to forget about. And I am not going to let you forget about it, because the avoiding is the part of the story that explains why the call I am about to make is so hard. I want to tell you about the heiress now. I am not going to use her name in this recording because the not using is the only kindness I am willing to extend to her in this version of my life. And the not using is also the small protection I'm giving to the version of her that is currently still living the early part of her own life, 2.5 years before the wet road, in the city where the wet road has not yet been driven on, in a body that has not yet committed the act that is going to commit it. The heiress is 26 years old in this version. She has not yet inherited the part of her family's holdings that she is going to inherit on her 28th birthday. The inheritance that is going to give her access to the kind of money that hires the kind of people who put bullets in the chest of the boyfriends who have outlived their usefulness. She is currently a graduate student in a small art history program at a small university on the north side of the city, and she is currently dating a man named Kalen Ross. And the man named Kalen Ross is the version of me that has not yet been killed because I have not let him be killed, because the second life began on the morning 2 years and 4 months ago, and I have been very carefully steering the man named Kalen Ross away from her ever since. In the small, careful ways a man can steer himself away from a woman without making the steering visible to either of them. The steering has worked. In this version of the second life, I have not approached her. I have not gone to the small art opening at the gallery on Wexler Street where, in the other life, I had met her on a Friday evening in late September of my 29th year. I have not accepted the invitation to the small private dinner at her family's estate that, in the other life, I had attended 6 weeks after the gallery. An invitation that her father had quietly arranged because her father had wanted to assess me and had decided, after the dinner, that I was the kind of small, ambitious man who could be useful to the family for a while and disposed of when the use was finished. I have not spent the next 4 years of my life as the small, ambitious man at the edge of her family. I have not become the boyfriend who was the public face of the small, clean girlfriend image she had needed to maintain while her family had been negotiating a series of mergers that required her to look like a young woman with a stable personal life. I have not been the package the family had quietly decided to deliver on the wet road on the night of my 34th birthday, because the mergers had been completed and the small, clean girlfriend image had been retired and the boyfriend had been quietly added to the small list of loose ends that needed to be cleaned up before the inheritance could be transferred without complication. I have done none of those things in the second life. I have spent the 2 years and 4 months since I woke up on the morning of my 29th year doing the small, careful work of becoming a different man. I left the marketing firm I had been working at, the one where she had first heard my name from a mutual acquaintance who had recommended me to her family. I started a small business of my own. Yeah, a small consulting practice for nonprofits on the north side of the city, the kind of business that would not have brought me into her social orbit. I moved out of the apartment in the building her father had quietly owned, the building I had been living in when she met me, the building that had been the small first move in the slow positioning that had ended on the wet road. I rented a smaller apartment in a part of the city she did not visit. I cut off the small handful of mutual acquaintances who had connected me to her circle in the other life. I disappeared from the small, specific corner of the city where the other life had taken place. The disappearing took 6 months. The disappearing was the easiest part of the second life, because the disappearing did not require me to do anything except not show up. And the not showing up was a thing I could do simply by staying in my small new apartment and sleeping the deep, careful sleep of a man who had been given a second chance and had decided to use the chance very quietly. The hard part was the part that came after the disappearing. The hard part was the realization, around the 8th month of the second life, that disappearing from the wet road was not the same as building a life that was worth not dying on the wet road for, and that I had spent the first 8 months of my second chance treating the second chance as a thing I had been given to avoid, instead of a thing I had been given to use. And the using was the thing the second life had actually been given to me for, and I had not been doing it. I want you to understand the difference, because the difference is the engine of the next part of the story. Avoiding the wet road meant never going near the woman who had ordered the bullets. Using the second chance meant going near the woman who had cried for the man on the table, and the going near her was the thing I had been delaying, because the going near her required me to confront the question of whether I deserved to be near her at all, and the question was a question I did not have an answer to. The second life began to feel like a kind of prison around the 10th month. I was free of the wet road. I was free of the heiress and her family and the slow positioning. I was alive, but I was alive in a small apartment in a part of the city I did not love, working at a small business that paid the bills but did not feel like a calling. I was with no friends except the small handful of professional contacts I had made through the business, and no romantic life at all, because I had been so careful about avoiding the heiress that I had become a man who avoided everyone, and the avoiding had become a habit, and the habit had become a personality. And the personality was the personality of a man who had been given a second life and was using the second life to be slightly less dead than the first life, which is not the same thing as being alive. The 14th month was when I started looking up Mera Halverson. The looking up was small at first. I read about her work in a medical journal article that I found in a search for cardiac surgeons in the city. I found out that she had been promoted to head of cardiac surgery at St. Aurel Memorial 6 months earlier, and on the basis of a complicated case she had handled the previous winter, a case I had read about and not understood the medical details of, but had understood. In the small, careful way you understand things you read about people you have already met in another version of your life, that the case had been the kind of case that confirms a person's vocation. I found out that she had been on the board of a small free clinic in the south side of the city for 11 years. A clinic that served patients who could not afford regular hospital care. A clinic she volunteered at on her one day off every week. I found out that she had been married once, briefly, in her late 20s, to a fellow resident who had taken a position in another country and asked her to come with him, and she had refused. And because the small clinic on the south side had needed her, and she had divorced him quietly 2 years later, and she had not remarried. I found out that she lived alone in a small apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, that she had a dog she had adopted from a shelter 4 years ago, that she had a sister who lived in another city and visited twice a year, that her parents had both died before she had finished medical school, that the small white card she had handed me at the end of my appointment was the same small white card she handed to every patient, but that the calling of the number was something most patients never did, the way she had told me in the examination room. I found out all of this over the course of about 3 weeks of small, careful research, and at the end of the 3 weeks I made the appointment. And the appointment was the thing I had been delaying for 14 months without knowing I was delaying it, because the delaying had been disguised as caution, and the caution had been the small, false name I had given to the cowardice that was actually keeping me away from the only person in the second life I had ever wanted to walk toward. The appointment happened. I have already told you about it. The appointment was small and clean and ordinary in the way that the most important moments of your life are sometimes small and clean and ordinary. The handing over of the small white card was the thing I had not been preparing for, because the small white card had not been part of my plan, and the small white card was a thing she had given me without me asking for it. And no, and the giving had broken something open in me that the planning had been keeping closed. I went home after the appointment. I sat on my couch with the card in my hands, the way I have been telling you. I have been doing this every evening for 3 weeks. I have been holding the card and I have been trying to call the number and I have been not calling the number because every time I have lifted my phone to dial, the same thing has happened in my chest. And the thing is, the small private question I'm going to tell you about now, because the question is the heart of this entire recording. The question is, do I deserve her? I want you to understand what I mean by the question, because the question is not the small self-pitying question that the title of this recording would like it to be. The question is a real question, and the real question has a real answer, and I have been trying to figure out the answer for 3 weeks, and I am only just beginning to. In the other life, I was the kind of man who got into a black car with a woman whose family I had been quietly suspicious of for almost a year on a wet night in late October because the woman had asked me to come with her to a small private meeting at the family estate, and I had said yes, even though every honest part of me had been telling me for months that the meeting was not a meeting, and the family was not a family, and the woman was not a woman who loved me, and the asking was a thing I should have refused. I said yes because the version of me who said yes had become very good over 4 years at saying yes to things he should have refused. And the version of me had become very good at it because saying no would have meant losing the small comfortable life he had built at the edge of her family, and the small comfortable life had become the thing he was protecting. And the thing he was protecting had become more important to him than the small honest part of himself that had been telling him to refuse. I died on the wet road because I had spent 4 years training myself to ignore the small honest part of myself, and the training had been so thorough that on the night I needed the small honest part the most, I could not hear it anymore, and the not hearing was the thing that put me in the back of the black car. And the back of the black car was the thing that put me on Mera Halverson's operating table. And the operating table was where I had stopped being the kind of man who deserved to be operated on by a woman like her, because the kind of man who deserved her would not have gotten into the car in the first place. That was the question. The question was whether I had become, in the second life, a man who deserved the kind of woman who would cry against the tile wall in a corridor for a man whose name she had never been told, or whether I was still the same man who had gotten into the car, a man who had simply been given the small mercy of avoiding the car this time, but who had not actually changed in the way that the deserving would have required. I sat with the question for 3 weeks. I did not call the number. I did not call the number because every time I almost called, I would feel the small honest part of myself, the part I had spent 4 years training myself to ignore in the other life, the part I had been slowly getting back in touch with in the second life, and the small honest part would say, in a voice that was clear and quiet, Kaylin, you are not calling her because you are afraid she will see what kind of man you actually are. And if she sees it, she will not want you, and you would rather not call her at all than call her and find out that she does not want you. The small honest part was right. The small honest part is always right. The small honest part is the part I had been killed for ignoring in the other life, and the small honest part is the part I have been trying to rebuild in this life. And the rebuilding is the only work I have been doing that matters. I made the call this morning. I want to tell you about the call, because the call is the reason I'm sitting in the coffee shop on the corner of Mercer and Vine right now, recording this on the small voice recorder I have been carrying for the last 3 weeks, with a coffee getting cold in front of me and the small white card on the table beside the recorder and the late afternoon light coming through the window in the slow, careful way the light comes through windows in early autumn. I called at 9 o'clock in the morning. The number went directly to a small voicemail in her professional voice, the same voice I had heard in the examination room, telling me that she was in surgery and would return calls in the afternoon. I left a message. The message was short. I said, Dr. Halverson, this is Kaylin Ross. I came to see you 3 weeks ago about a chest ache that turned out to be nothing. So I'm calling because I have been carrying your card in my pocket for 3 weeks and I have finally figured out what I want to ask you. And the asking is going to sound strange and I am going to ask you anyway. Because I think the asking is the only thing left in my life that I'm still afraid of, and I have decided that I'm tired of being afraid of it. I would like to know if you would be willing to have a cup of coffee with me. Not as a doctor, not as a patient, just as two people in the same city who might be the kind of people who would like to know each other if they were given the chance to find out. I am going to be at the coffee shop on the corner of Mercer and Vine this afternoon from 3 o'clock onward. I will stay until 6 o'clock, if you are not able to come. I said, or if you are able to come, but the asking I just did is not the kind of asking you want to receive. Please do not feel any obligation to respond. I'm going to be all right either way. I just wanted to ask. Thank you for the work you do. The message I just left was the hardest message I have ever left in my life. Goodbye. I hung up. I went to the coffee shop. I have been here since 3 o'clock. It is now 4:42. She has not come. I'm not certain she is going to come. I'm not certain she is going to call back. I'm not certain she even listened to the message. I am sitting here in the late afternoon light with a coffee that has gone completely cold. And I'm recording this because I have realized in the last hour of waiting that the recording is the thing I needed to make whether she comes or not. Why? Because the recording is the small private witness to the fact that I made the call, and the making of the call is the thing the second life was given to me for, and the giving is now complete, and the rest of what happens is the rest of what happens. And the rest of what happens is going to be all right. Because the small, honest part of myself that I have been rebuilding for 2 years and 4 months is the part that made the call, and the part is mine again, and the having of it back is the only thing I needed from the second chance, and the small, honest part is going to be enough to live the rest of this life on. Whether or not the woman I called this morning ever walks through the door of this coffee shop. The bell over the door of the coffee shop just rang. I'm going to stop the recording now. I want to tell you the rest. Yeah, because the rest is the part the title of this recording has been promising, but I'm not going to tell you the rest in detail because the rest belongs to the small private space between two people in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, and the small private space is the only thing in the second life that I'm going to keep entirely for myself. I will tell you only the shape. The shape is that the woman who walked through the door at 4:43 was not Dr. Mera Halverson. The woman who walked through the door was a stranger, a woman in a yellow coat looking for a friend who was already sitting at a table by the window. I felt something move in my chest, and the something was not disappointment. Exactly, the something was the small, clean recognition that the world was not going to give me the easy ending, and that the easy ending was not what I had called her for. I sat with the recognition for about 10 minutes. I was about to pay for my cold coffee and leave when the bell over the door rang again, and this time the woman who walked through the door was Dr. Mera Halverson, in a long gray coat with her hair pulled back in the small, careful way she had worn it in the examination room. And she stopped just inside the door and she looked around the coffee shop until her eyes found me at the table by the window. And she walked over and she sat down across from me and she said, "Mr. Ross, I almost did not come. And I want to tell you why I almost did not come before I tell you why I came anyway." She said, "In 11 years of practicing medicine, I have never had a patient call me for the reason you called me for. And I have had patients call me for almost every other reason a person can call a doctor for. And the not having had this particular call before made me suspicious, because suspicion is the small professional habit I have built up over 11 years. And the suspicion told me that you were either a man with bad intentions or a man who was about to ask me for something I could not give him. I almost did not come because of the suspicion. The reason I came anyway is that the message you left was the message of a man who was afraid. And the afraid in your voice was a specific kind of afraid that I have heard before. Guys, and the kind that I have heard before is the kind I hear from the patients who are about to make a difficult decision and who are calling me because they need to talk to someone who will tell them the truth about what they are about to do. The afraid in your voice was the kind of afraid I trust, and the trusting brought me here, and I am going to ask you the same question I asked you in the examination room 3 weeks ago, which is, why did you really call me today? And I want you to tell me the truth this time, because the answer you gave me in the examination room was a smaller answer than the question deserved, and I would like the larger answer if you have one. I told her, not all of it. But I did not tell her about the wet road, or the bullets, or the woman in the front passenger seat, or the strange floating space, or the crying against the tile wall, because telling her any of that would have made me the kind of man she was suspicious of when she walked through the door. I told her the part of the truth that was sayable. I told her that I had been a different kind of man 2.5 years ago, the kind of man who had been on a path that I had been very lucky to step off of, and that the stepping off had been hard and quiet and had taken me almost 2 years. And that during the stepping off, I had spent a lot of time alone, and that the aloneness had become a habit, and that the habit had become a personality, and that I had decided 3 weeks ago that I needed to start asking the kind of questions that broke the habit. And that the first question I had wanted to ask was the question I had asked her on the phone this morning, and that the asking had been hard because the asking required me to be a different kind of man than the kind of man I had been on the path I had stepped off of, and that I was still figuring out whether I was the different kind of man, and that I had called her because I had a small private feeling that she was the kind of person who would be able to tell me whether I was, even though I knew she did not know me well enough to actually tell, and the small private feeling had been the only thing I had been able to follow in the entire second chance I had been given, and I had decided to follow it because I was tired of not following anything. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, as she sat with the coffee she had ordered for almost a minute without speaking, then she said, "Mister." Ross, I am going to tell you something, and I'm going to tell you because the answer you just gave me was the larger answer the question deserved, and the deserving has earned you something honest in return. She said, when I shook your hand at the end of your appointment 3 weeks ago, I had a small specific feeling that I have not had about a patient in 11 years of practice, and the feeling was that I was going to see you again under circumstances that had nothing to do with medicine. I do not know where the feeling came from. I do not believe in the kinds of things that produce feelings like that. I believed in the feeling anyway because the feeling was clear, and the clear feelings are the ones I have learned to trust over the years. I gave you my direct line because I give my direct line to every patient. Oh, but I gave it to you knowing, in the small private way you know things, that you were going to be one of the patients who called, and that the calling was not going to be about your heart because there was nothing wrong with your heart, and we both knew it before we were finished talking. I have been waiting 3 weeks for you to call. I want you to know that. I have not been waiting in the way that suggests I had any idea what I was waiting for. I have been waiting in the way that a person waits when she has set down a book she has not finished reading, and she does not know yet whether she is going to pick the book back up, but she has not put the book on the shelf either, because the book is still on the small table by the chair, and the table is the place where the unfinished things go. You were on the table for 3 weeks. As Sneo, you called this morning. I came to the coffee shop because the calling moved you off the table. I am not going to pretend this is a normal way to have coffee with a stranger. I am going to tell you that I am here because the situation does not feel like a stranger's situation, and that I'm going to find out over the next hour and the next several conversations after this one, if they happen, whether the not feeling like a stranger is a real thing or whether it is the small professional intuition of a doctor who has been seeing too many patients lately and who has begun to mistake patterns for meanings. I'm going to find out by talking to you slowly over time, the way two people find out about each other when they have decided that the finding out is worth doing. Is that all right? I told her it was all right. Yeah, we talked for almost 2 hours. The talking was the easiest 2 hours of conversation I have ever had with another human being. And the easiness was the part I had not been preparing for, because I had spent 2 years and 4 months preparing for the difficulty of the moment I had finally walked into. And the moment had not been difficult. The moment had been easy, and the easiness was the small final piece of the second life that I had not known I had been waiting for. We did not talk about anything important. We talked about her dog. We talked about the small free clinic on the south side of the city where she volunteers on her one day off. We talked about the small consulting practice I had started 2 years ago, at the one I had been treating as a small dull job and had now started to see as the beginning of a thing I might actually love, because I was telling her about it and the telling was making me notice things about it I had not noticed when I had been telling myself about it alone. We talked about the city in autumn and about the coffee shop and about the small worn paperback she had been carrying in her bag and that she had set on the table between us at some point during the second hour without explaining why. We did not talk about her ex-husband or about any version of my past that involved a wet road or about the crying against the tile wall or about any of the things that were going to be part of the long, slow conversation we were going to have over the next several years if we were lucky. We talked about small things. While in the small, careful way, you talk about small things when the small things are the only things you have permission to talk about yet, and the small things were enough. We are going to have coffee again next Tuesday. She suggested the day. I agreed. I'm going to bring the small white card with me so that I can give it back to her because I have been carrying it for 3 weeks and the carrying is finished, and the not carrying is the small physical proof that the call has been made and the meeting has been had, and the next thing is the next thing. I am writing this last part of the recording from the small park 3 blocks from the coffee shop, on a bench under a tree that is in the small, careful process of turning the color of autumn. Mera left about 20 minutes ago, and she had to go back to the hospital for a small administrative thing. She squeezed my hand before she left. The squeezing was the 3rd time in this life that I had touched her, and the touching was the thing I am going to keep with me until next Tuesday. And after next Tuesday, there will be a 4th time, and the 4th time will be the small, careful proof that the second life is moving forward. And the moving is the only thing the second life was given to me to do. I am not going to marry her tomorrow. I am not going to marry her next week. I am not going to marry her next year, probably. The title of this recording, with the word marry in it, is a title that wants to compress the long, slow, careful work of 2 people getting to know each other into a single dramatic decision. As in, the long, slow, careful work is the only kind of work I'm interested in doing in the second life. And the long, slow, careful work is the part the title cannot fit. I'm going to do the long, slow, careful work. I'm going to do it with her, if she lets me, and if it turns out that the long, slow, careful work is the thing the 2 of us are supposed to do together. I'm going to do it with the kind of patience that the version of me on the wet road did not have. because the version of me on the wet road had spent 4 years training himself to be impatient about the wrong things, and the impatience had killed him, and I am not going to be killed by impatience again. The marrying, if it happens, is going to happen at the end of the long, slow, careful work, and the end of the long, slow, careful work is going to be many years from now. Yet, and the many years are the years I have been given a second time, and I'm going to spend them carefully. The heiress is somewhere in the city right now. I know this because I know what the second life is. She is 26 years old. She's a graduate student in art history. She has not yet inherited the part of her family's holdings that will give her access to the kind of money that hires the kind of people who put bullets in chess. She has not yet met the version of me that would have died for her, because that version of me does not exist in this life. She is going to live her life, whatever shape it takes, and the shape is not my problem anymore. And the not my problem is the small final freedom the second life has given me. I do not wish her well. I do not wish her ill. I wish her absent, was in the specific narrow sense that I want her to be absent from the rest of my life, and the wishing is the only thing I'm ever going to do about her, because doing anything else would be the kind of small bitter act that the version of me on the wet road would have done, and I am not going to be that version of me anymore. The bench I'm sitting on is cold. The light is starting to turn the color it turns in early autumn evenings, the soft gold color that makes everything in the park look slightly more important than it actually is. I'm going to walk back to my apartment. I'm going to put the small voice recorder in the drawer of my desk where I keep the small private objects of the second life. Yet the drawer that contains the small worn copy of the train schedule I had bought on the morning I had woken up in my own bed 2.5 years ago. The drawer that contains a small notebook in which I had written, on the second day of the second life, the names of every person I needed to never see again. I'm going to put the recording in the drawer next to those objects, because the recording is now one of the small private objects of the second life, and the drawer is the place where the small private objects go. The small white card is in my coat pocket. I'm going to keep it there until next Tuesday, when I am going to give it back to Mera at the coffee shop on the corner of Mercer and Vine. But the giving is going to be the small ceremony that marks the end of the part of the second life that was about avoidance and the beginning of the part that is about something else. I do not have a name for the something else yet. The name will come later, the way names of important things always come later, after the things they are naming have already started to exist. I am going to stand up from the bench now. I am going to walk home. The walking is going to take about 20 minutes. The 20 minutes are going to be the first 20 minutes of the rest of my life. And the rest of my life is going to be longer than the first life was. Because the bullets are not going to find the version of me that is walking home in the soft gold light of an early autumn evening in a city that does not know it almost killed me. And the not finding is the only ending I have ever wanted, and the only ending I have, and the having is enough, and the enough is everything, and I am going home.